Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Yo, Daph, what's going on?
Nothing much. Did you hear the news on Facebook that I passed my dissertation proposal?
Hey.
I am officially a PhD candidate. Oh my God. It's
PhD
official.
Candidate? That's what's up.
Yeah.
You finished?
Yeah.
So for all our listeners who don't know, not familiar with it, Daphne is now ABD, meaning all but dissertation. So once she write that dissertation, she'll have her PhD and be finished.
Yes. And also, once the IRB approves my protocol, there's this institutional review board, and they make sure that we're not going to do harm to people the way researchers have done harm to people in the past, particularly Black people. So it's for everybody's protection, but it can take a while for those to get through. So
man,
fingers crossed, pray for me, y'all.
Yeah, you'll be fine. I remember when I did my RB, it had to go through full board review.
Oh, wow.
And my advisor, it was supposed to be me and her, and she couldn't make it at the last minute because she was an associate dean. And, I'm thinking, okay, the review board's going to be like 5-7 people. Man, I walked up in that room, it was like 30 people.
Oh, wow.
And they had me sitting there in the front. I was by myself, no advisor. And they was drilling me asking questions, but I held it down though.
Yeah, you got that PhD. You definitely did hold it down.
Yeah, I wish I known. It was good. It was all right though. It was all right. Yeah, it was crazy.
What's been up with you?
Semester ended. Congrats to all my students graduating yesterday.
Yay!
A lot of them are going on to bigger and better things, and now I get to start my summer. And no more classes. Officially started my summer vacay. So not really a vacay. Got to start writing and stuff this week. Get this paper out to get published. But other than that, I'm glad to not have to actually physically go to work for a few months.
That's so nice. That's so nice. But congrats to you students.
Congrats to you. All right. We got some Oh Lord news to start us off. Sure.
Of course we do. Of course. Right. Unfortunately.
Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to BHD News, where we give you the most current and eye-opening Oh Lord news of the week. Join us as we present news that'll make you want to say,
Okay, so you know how just this past week we asked Dr. Nicole Sparks how husbands and fathers can be of great support to their professional women. Mm-hmm. Well, that can get you in trouble if you're Black. In DC, a lawyer decided to stay home with his sick child and wanted to allow the child to get some fresh air. So he took the baby in a stroller to walk around the park, and a white woman called park security and said that a suspicious man was walking the bike path with a baby.
Oh my goodness, man. Oh man, just when I think like every week that it can't get worse, it gets worse. This is crazy. It's just crazy.
And so the good thing is it was not a police officer, it was park security. And they actually kind of approached the man, just kind of like warning him what was said and not like you did something wrong. So, that's the good thing about this story. It was kind of like, watch out for yourself. You got women calling because you're walking around with your baby.
You can't sleep while Black. You can't go on college tours while Black. You can't do all these. And now you can't walk your baby in the park while Black. Like, you can't be a dad and Black. Yo, Oh my God,
Oh
this
my
is so crazy, man. And you know what? A lot of people have been like really get these oh Lord news segments. A lot of people have really been getting their eye open to a lot of these issues going on. So I think we are doing a service by exposing this, and also that it's not just a one-time thing, people. Right? This is
happening
week.
a lot. For the second story, this is kind of funny, and it's just kind of like a hoop dream story.
Mhm.
So in Dallas, Texas, a guy named Sidney Gilstrap Portley, he 7 years ago, he had his chance on the high school basketball team, but he wanted to do it all over again. He found an opportunity to play high school basketball again by claiming to be a Hurricane Harvey refugee and convincing school officials that he was 17 years old. And he spent the entire school year playing on a basketball team.
Oh my God. How old was he?
25.
Yo. Oh my God, man.
And he dated a 14-year-old classmate.
No, that's crazy.
Yes. And it got found out because his former high school basketball coach spotted him at a game or something like that, and then ended up telling officials. But it's crazy.
This dude is 25. He was my student.
Well, they say black don't crack, so maybe they didn't know he was 25.
I didn't know. Oh my goodness, that's crazy. You want to play basketball that bad, man? You want to go back
that
to
bad?
School? I'm sure they got AAU teams and adult teams, or come on, man. I guess he wanted to feel like the man. He had to be. He better have been the best player on that team.
Right.
25.
You had your second chance.
That's crazy.
And so this last news story, it kind of gets into our topic for today, which we did not plan this topic around, this particular incident, but it's just crazy that it's happened again. So I'm pretty sure you heard about the Santa Fe high school shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the NRA, always, they don't want to politicize things, or, they want to find a scapegoat for these incidents that happen with guns. And so the newly appointed president for the National Rifle Association, Oliver North, suggested that the shooting was caused by ADHD medicine called Ritalin and violent TV.
Oh my goodness, man. Come on.
It's not at all because people have access to guns that should not have them. It's drugs and rock and roll,
Yeah. It's crazy, man. Come on now. Let's call it is, but it's not always related to drugs or mental health, whatever they're trying to say, ADHD. Every shooting it's not the case. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in this episode. So I'm not gonna go into too many details.
Yeah. But I just thought it was crazy. We, decided to have this episode. We had a conversation about it. And then I wake up and find out that the shooting has happened. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, I immediately text you like, did you see this?
Yes.
Did you see this?
Yes.
Crazy.
It's crazy in a lot of ways. Again, like Daphne said, to reiterate, we did not plan to have this episode because of the Santa Fe shooting. It was largely because of the discussion that was centered around Donald Glover's "This Is America." Again, Bino's "This Is America" video. And people asked us, hey, to touch on this topic. We said, for sure, it's an important topic to talk about. And then long and behold, we have this issue happen on Friday with the school shooting, where 10 kids were killed and some teachers were killed as well. To a guy that was linked to white supremacist groups, Nazi paraphernalia, all this kind of stuff. And, one of the things that frustrates me about it, I was kind of telling Daphne earlier, is that for some reason, the government will not label this group as a terrorist group when nothing they stand for is positive, and they do spew violence and promote violence, and it happens and they propagate it in a lot of ways. But yet they'll put, protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that on a particular watch list, but they won't do it to people actually going out here and killing kids. Really sad truth, man.
Yeah. What was interesting, what you said to me, and I was just like, wow, is so Ty I think it was Saturday, and I guess everyone was so excited about the royal wedding that nobody was really talking about the shooting. And you were like, this is exactly what Donald Glover was talking about in This Is America. You go from this crazy shooting to like, we forget it all because, some exciting or fun or popular thing happens. Yeah.
Bomb on that. Because that's crazy.
No, I was just like, it's true. I was just like, wow.
Yeah, I was like, I was really, I was in my office Saturday morning waiting for graduation. And then I was just scrolling through my timeline. And everybody was just talking about the royal wedding. I mean, it was like everybody was going. And, I understand its importance, why people feel it's important. I'm not going to knock anybody for watching the wedding, right? But it was, to me, just looking about, because what this week's topic was about was This Is America, and how in the video, when there would be shootings and there would be distractions right away, or the shooting wouldn't be seen as serious because they would move directly onto the next scene. And this is exactly what happened. It wasn't even 24 hours after 10 people died going to school that people were on to the next topic, and the news was covering that overwhelmingly. And nobody was even talking or concerned about the shootings anymore. How quickly we just forgot, it was, I don't know. And I think, I think it was one of the first times myself just catching it in the moment, not like thinking about it later on. It was just like, I was in the moment. I was seeing it was happening. I'm like, yo, this is kind of insane how once the media switches gears, everyone switched gears, and that's all they were talking about, that wedding. The wedding was whatever. I didn't watch it. I seen clips of it, and the black choir and the black preacher and stuff like that. There are some things I had that I was frustrated with people saying about the wedding, with her being like the first black royalty and all this kind of stuff, which is clearly not the case. We've had black royalty forever in African history, etc. We've always known that. But yet for some reason, people are acting like this is the first time. And it kind of troubles me a little bit, because it's like, we're not legitimized unless it happens in white spaces, right? And people are like, oh man, black royalty, we love it. Let's watch it. Let's support. People are comparing it to Barack Obama winning and everything. I'm like, come on, people. Like, yes, it's a good occasion. Yes, it's something new, but it's not the first time. We have our own royalty. We have our own prestige. And I think we need to be just as enthusiastic about that when it happens, and raise awareness on that when it happens, than just when it happens in these white countries,
I agree, because actually just last year, I think in October, a Black American woman married an Ethiopian prince. She was from DC. They met in DC, and it was a very beautiful wedding. And, they are, black love. So it's just kind of like, it is interesting how that didn't get the same type of attention that, this royal wedding had. I was asleep. I stayed up all night, Friday night working. So I was like, I'm asleep. But, more power to Meghan Markle.
Congrats. Weddings are beautiful. Love is love. Love is beautiful. Not that whatsoever. But just the response of how quickly we forgot the shooting, how everybody forgets about other black royalty. It didn't sit well with me. But, to each his own.
Yeah.
To each his own.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm ready to get started on this episode and, just kind of get into the discussion about why these types of things keep happening and the barriers to actually making change, especially when it comes to shootings and guns and things of that nature. So,
Yes, this episode is meant to just provide information to all of you about gun control, gun policy, the debate, give you information, give you stats, add hopefully more knowledge to the conversation. What you'll see is that it's not just a, black and white issue, right? That it's not one or two ways, yes to no guns and no to guns. There's a lot more nuance to it and a lot more details involved in it. So we just wanted to elaborate on those details so you can see, the more informed you are, then I think the better decisions we can make when it comes to gun control, gun policies, and really trying to put an end to these mass killings, because it's just, it's getting out of hand. It really is. We can't not do anything about it anymore.
So,
all right,
let's get started.
Let's get into it. All right, catch y'all later.
Okay.
All right, hello everyone. Today, as we kind of discussed in the opening, We'll be talking about gun control, gun policy, all of that good stuff. I know some of our listeners have been chiming in and sending us emails and stuff, wanting us to really address this issue, mainly because it became a hot topic during the This Is America video with Childish Gambino. And we thought it'd be a good opportunity to shed some light on gun control, gun policy, gun violence, all of the above, and take some time to chat with you all and chat with each other about this topic, and hopefully inform you and maybe some things you haven't heard before.
I agree. What I found interesting, especially you mentioned the Childish Gambino video, despite the fact that I feel like I and lots of Americans have been personally kind of desensitized to like seeing people shot. Like we see it in movies. We all like celebrate like these violent things that happen. But when I saw that video, I actually had like a very strong reaction. So I agree that I feel like these are conversations that have been happening because of, all of these mass shootings that are in the media. But I feel like that kind of shocked people in a sense, and just opening up the conversation, hopefully. Yeah. So kind of thinking about that, like before we begin the topic, I was wondering, what is your experience with guns? Like you personally, Ty, like,
yeah,
have any? Have you? Yeah.
No, I don't own any guns. And I wasn't really raised around a lot of guns. I mean, growing up, my dad was in the Marines, and then he was a corrections officer. So I know he had experience and had firearms, but we never saw them, me and my brothers, even though we know he had them. I think he maybe kept them on the job and stuff like that. But being raised in the Northeast, pretty strict gun laws. So people having guns wasn't frequent. And, I didn't see like a lot of my friends and family didn't really have exposed guns. Now, of course, growing up, high school, things like that, some people associated maybe had guns illegally, but yeah, not really myself or like many of my close associates. And then when I got to graduate school, and I was in Indiana, way lax gun laws. And so I would go to the range sometimes, the shooting range, and get some exposure to it, and, felt the gun, shot some guns, and really just kind of like, I wasn't familiar with doing that growing up. And so then, being in Indiana, I had the opportunity to do it. And I also had a couple of friends in Indiana purchase guns while in graduate school too, legally, and was very, very easy to do. So not well experienced with guns or like always around them, but I had some exposure to them. How about you?
Well, first of all, shout out to the Marines. My brother is a vet. He was in the Marines.
Oh, nice.
So shout out to them.
Simplify.
Yes. But me, I'm from the South, and I feel like gun culture is just really a thing, even among Black people. My dad has like so many guns. He keeps one on him legally. He's pulled out guns on people who wanted to date me.
Oh, my God.
And it's something that literally, like, I have had to warn, like, people I've dated and stuff, like, okay, don't be alarmed if he does this. And then I'll also give him the talk, like, Dad, please don't pull out a gun. Like, this is a good guy. Like, don't do that. Yeah, and he always does it anyway. Like, oh, let me go to my car and get my piece or something. He crazy. Yeah. And like, so he loves guns. My brother-in-law, has guns. My brother was in the Marines. I don't think he has a gun or owns a gun, but it's just kind of like, at least the men in my life have been like gun men. I personally have not held one. I haven't shot one, although like you, I have been interested in going to the gun range just to see. My dad really wants me to have a gun, but I've always wanted to find like alternatives. Like I do want to feel safe, but it's kind of like, can I have a taser? Like in some states, that's not even legal. You can have a gun, but you can't have a taser. Because I looked it up, or like mace and stuff like that. So I feel like I have always tried to search for alternatives just because I'm afraid of guns myself. What if I accidentally shoot myself? Like, it's a lot of people that do that. So, yeah.
That's real, and I think this is part of the conversation. And even now, as I am getting older and, I want to have kids and my family grow, I've been thinking about like, should I get a gun, legally, to protect my family? I know that's one of the biggest reasons people want guns in this country, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I kind of feel that way. And it's something that growing up I didn't want, but now I feel like we're living in a day and age where, I don't know, things is just happening, with either mass shootings or just, being in certain situations with certain people. And I feel like, not for myself, but if I had kids and things like that, I just want to be able to protect them, and make sure we can get out of this situation unscathed. So it's a thought in the back of my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting how, like you said, we'll get to it later in terms of like people linking like gun ownership to protection or safety. Mm-hmm. But I feel like at the foundation, I feel like of why a lot of people want guns, especially those that are like members of like the NRA and stuff like that, is this like idea, like I want to own a gun because it's my right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's the big thing, right? When they're talking about the Second Amendment and we're having these gun control debates, that is one of the foundation or cornerstone pieces of that conversation. And I'll talk about it really briefly. When we talk about the Second Amendment, right, there's two parts to the conversation. And legally, this is where a lot of the conversation has been happening in the debate, because I'll read the statement of the Second Amendment. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, so this is where, the states have given us, the federal government has given the states to control as far as who can own and the rights to bear arms. Now, the debate is, when this was written, okay, we were talking about, hundreds of years ago, and we're thinking about the authors of this. Now, part of the debate, too, is if they saw the types of guns available today, would this still be a right? Because during this time period, it was, again, they just had finished the Revolutionary War and they wanted to, stop, other countries from attacking us. And so if all citizens had the right to do this, then it seemed more feasible. In this day and age, not so much. And especially with the type of assault rifles and weapons that we have today, was not available at all during this time period. But the legal debate, as far as why this has been untouched and what people are trying to say, is that the beginning of the statement, the subject matter, the people who the authors are saying it's intended for, is a well-regulated militia, meaning a trained kind of personnel, a trained organization that is used to use weapons. But however, in the second half of the statement, it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So a lot of the debate, when people are addressing this in the Supreme Court, et cetera, is what did the authors mean? In the beginning, it says clearly a well-regulated militia. Then later on, it says the right of the people. Now, the safe interpretation is for all people, right? And so this is where we say, and this is why all people have the right to bear arms now. But many people are debating saying, was that its original intent? We don't know. I think their original intent was stated in the first sentence when they said a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, saying that we need this militia to protect our freedom. Okay. And this is the right of these people to bear arms. But it's left to interpretation, and we're kind of in this limbo period right now, this gray area of what did they mean by it? But I think they were very clear in the beginning. I don't think it's that hard.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talked about like what guns look like back then versus what they look like now, and whether like the people who wrote the Second Amendment would actually agree. So like the typical Revolutionary era musket, it had a magazine capacity of 1 round versus today's typical AR-15 has a magazine capacity of 30 rounds. The effective rate of fire of the musket back then was like 3 rounds per minute versus a AR-15 is 45 rounds per minute. And then the muzzle velocity of the musket was 1,000 feet per second versus the muzzle velocity of an AR-15 is 3,260 feet per second.
My goodness.
Yes. And then the maximum accurate range of a musket was 50 meters versus the maximum accurate range for an AR-15 is 550 meters.
Mm-mm-mm.
So these are very different types of weapons. And yeah, I don't know if people had a vision for, you know, how weapons might develop over time. And like you said, looking at that first sentence, I don't think that people were talking about being able to walk around town with AR-15s. Do you remember that in Lafayette when, I can't remember when it was, but like people were walking around with assault rifles just to assert their ability to do so? Yeah, so it's crazy.
So yeah, this is where we're at, the Second Amendment. And then naturally moving forward, a big, I guess, subject matter of the gun control debate, or gun policy debate, whatever way the gun conversation is, the National Rifle Association, more commonly known as the NRA.
Yes. What I found interesting about the NRA, so when we're talking about history, we're talking about, you know, the foundations of the Second Amendment. Well, when you look at the foundation of the NRA, what's so interesting is that it was established by Union officers who were fighting on behalf of, you know, enslaved Africans. It was founded as a way to, as a marksman organization, so that they could become better shooters, because they were, I think it was something like they were wasting a lot of like ammo because they just weren't all that accurate. So it was less about like fighting for Second Amendment rights and more just about like trying to improve marksmanship and things of that nature. So I just find that really interesting. And in addition to that, like in its early years, they actually worked with the government to come up with common sense reforms around gun policies. When Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal, they had a National Firearms Act of 1934 and the Gun Control Act of 1938, which regulated guns and banned some buyers. And the NRA helped with that. They participated with that. And I was about to say, like, even in the 1960s, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, they weren't necessarily opposed to common sense things, often in response to some type of large scale shooting or shooting of a famous person. So it wasn't until like, I guess later in the 1960s and when riots started to happen and when the FBI started to collect statistics about crime and things of that nature, that this paranoia around like safety, that rhetoric began to emerge. And that's when we start to see a shift in the NRA in terms of, I need my guns. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, because I think, you know, I like how you mentioned how when it started, it was really about pretty much the Union soldiers were a terrible shot, and they were like, you know, we need to help y'all learn how to shoot. And this is why it was created, not for any kind of political motivations or anything along those lines. It was just to teach people how to shoot better because they felt they were a bad shot. I know, like they said, even on their websites, it's like their primary goal was to promote and encourage rifle shooting on a scientific basis. I mean, that was it. Right. Not protecting rights and doing all this other kind of stuff. They also work with things like the Boy Scouts. But I think another important thing where race is kind of involved, and I think this is where the NRA also began to switch gears a little bit, was kind of an unintended consequence with the dealings of the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party, again, Huey Newton was a law student, and he was the one that realized, like, hey, he looked at while in law school taking class, Second Amendment right, he was studying and learned about, and was like, yo, we have the right as citizens to carry guns and firearms. So this is when the Black Panther Party began to take firearms. They used to stand and watch the police with their firearms and the rifles on their shoulders to make sure that the police weren't, you know, doing anything bad. They were usually just carrying firearms to protect their community, rarely ever using them. It was more symbolism saying, hey, if you hit us, we're going to hit you back. As a result, the politicians, largely in California, began to scramble and take away gun legislation or try to make it harder for people to own guns, mainly in the Black community. During this transition of leadership with NRA, they were watching this and they said, whoa, if the government succeeds in doing this to the Black community or in this particular state, then they're going to do it everywhere. And that's going to be a threat to us and what we feel is important with our guns. And so then they became more politically involved in trying to engage politicians to make sure that they're not overturning these laws or protecting that Second Amendment right. And it really wasn't because of, any of their own doing. They were just seeing what was happening to the Black Panther Party and then fought back. And then it kind of curtailed and spun into what we see today, into the NRA. And if you look into the NRA and their history too, there was this push and pull because this new leadership was coming up and wanted to be more politically involved, while the old leadership was like, no, that's not us, right? They were trying to start a magazine and talk about guns and all this other kind of stuff, while this new leadership wanted to be politically involved. And over time, they were successful as far as pretty much overthrowing the old leadership and creating this kind of new NRA, was morphed into what we've seen today in the 70s. So it's important to know that this kind of NRA and the National Rifle Association is not what it's always been. And not until the 1990s is when it became a foundation and a tax-exempt organization, right? So it's only within these past 30 or so years that the NRA has been very much active politically. But way before that, that was not their purpose, that was not their mission, and they didn't want to touch it at all.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the Black Panther Party, because I was thinking about that too. For listeners, if you want to know more about the act that was created in response to the Black Panther Party, it's called the Mulford Act, and it was created to prohibit open carry of loaded firearms, along with an addendum prohibiting loaded firearms in the state capitol. And some of you may know if you watched the Black Panther movie, but on May 2nd, 1967, 30 Black Panthers walked into the California State Capitol building, and they had rifles and shotguns, and it garnered a lot of national attention. So
scared the mess out of the white folk.
That was a Black militia, but
they were not ready. They said, and they moved real quick to change them laws,
Move really quick to change those laws. I think it's so interesting now when we think about race and the NRA. For me, I think about the Philando Castile story in case, and how, I don't think Black people supported the NRA, but I think they wanted to look and see that there was no hypocrisy. So you had a person who was legally carrying a firearm, who was going to show, who was honest about it. I have this on me, officer, going to show a card, and he was killed. And the organization is supposed to protect gun owners, we don't want to say anything. So, yeah, that was a lot of hypocrisy.
Yeah, and I've been noticing too. A while ago, I found an article that was really discussing how Blacks, pretty much in response to the racial violence, more Blacks have been joining this NRA type thing, but it's not the NRA, it's Black. It's called the National African American Gun Association. And pretty much over this past, since Trump has been in office, its membership has tripled from 14 chapters to 42 chapters. And many of these people who are saying they are joining this organization are saying that they are joining it to defend themselves against racism, and are saying that this call to arms is part of this new civil rights struggle because a lot of the violence that have been happening against Black bodies. So we are seeing now an uptick of Black gun ownership, but not with the NRA, but with the separate organization, the National African American Gun Association. So I think that's important to pay attention to too, as time moves along, to see what can come of that. Maybe this organization can also be not just owning guns, but maybe politically engaged as well.
There's also Black women are starting to become like more gun owners. And so there's a Pink Pistols organization that was created for and by Black women. So it is really interesting that, I don't think Black people are against gun ownership, or I just know that in terms of they aren't represented by people like the NRA. And therefore, they're creating spaces on their own to, learn more about, responsible gun ownership, as well as, to protect their own rights and freedoms. So. Yeah,
exactly. So moving forward, it's good to really talk about, kind of paint a quick picture of what the gun scene looks like in America, of American gun ownership. And some of this information, or all this information I'm about to say, is coming from, the Pew Research Center, where, they always do tons of different studies and research on a lot of stuff. And this one is looking at gun ownership and kind of what the people are saying, or what the stats are. So to paint a picture, it says that 3 in 10 American adults say that they own a gun, in this country. And pretty much gun ownership cuts across all demographic groups, but is more concentrated in some areas, pretty much meaning white adults are more likely than blacks or Hispanics to own guns. White men are particularly the most likely to be gun owners. 48% of white men say they currently own a gun, which is almost half, compared to 24%. 24% of white women, and non-white men, and 16% of non-white women own guns. All right. And it said that Americans with less education, also are more likely to be gun owners. And there's a gap. It's pretty much the biggest among whites. We know that, me and Daphne kind of talked about this in the beginning. But there's a difference between kind of rural and urban areas. Rural areas, 46% say that they own a gun, versus 28% of those who live in suburban areas, and 19% in urban areas. So it's a kind of progressive decrease within that. And then also with party lines, 44% of Republicans and independents say they own a gun, with only 20% of Democrats saying that they own a gun. So there's also differences within the political parties too, as far as who owns guns and who doesn't. And we're going to talk about this more a little bit moving on. But the number one reason why people own, or they say they own a gun in this country, is for protection. 67% of people who own guns say they use it, or they have a gun for protection purposes. Well, only 38% say they have it for hunting. And another 30% saying they have it for, around 30% saying they have it for shooting, or like sporting and stuff like that. And a very, very small percentage of them say they have it for collections. Most gun owners owning a firearm is tied really to their sense of personal freedom. So 74% say that people who own guns say they own guns, and they protect that right to freedom, going along Second Amendment, democracy, all that kind of stuff. And it's different in party lines, but we may talk about that in a little bit. And finally, gun owners and non-owners disagree on many gun policy proposals as far as what they would like to see be fixed with the gun issues. And also Republicans and Democrats don't see eye to eye, but this can also probably be linked to the overlap of who owns guns and who doesn't. Now, there is some agreement between most of them. The biggest areas of agreement really between gun owners and non-gun owners is really limiting gun access for people with mental illnesses and individuals who are on like federal no-fly or terrorist watch lists. So that has some of the biggest. Both gun owners and non-gun owners agree on that the biggest issue, which is important because we'll talk about that.
So, yeah, I was about to say, I did think it was interesting that there was such consensus, literally the same numbers, like 89%, strongly or somewhat favoring preventing those with mental illness from purchasing guns. And so in thinking about that broad consensus between gun owners and non-gun owners, I'm wondering like why from like a publicity or public relations standpoint, the NRA just doesn't go for that easy win in terms of conceding that point maybe. So in addition to that, also like the background checks for private gun sales, although it's not the same, it's like 77% and 87%, like the vast majority, as well as, like you said, the no fly, like that's in the 80% range between like gun owners and non-gun owners. So it's just kind of like people have broad consensus on like a few common sense gun reform things. And I'm just wondering why we don't just do those things.
Yeah, it's nobody understands why. I think a part of it may be because if the NRA feels if they give a little bit, right, to gun reform, then they feel like the floodgates are open and then it'll just open the door to a lot of other things. So I think this is why they're also hesitant. But another thing is that, in order to get a gun, that's already a part of the background check process, is checking for if someone has mental illness as well. So it's really trying to reform that aspect, which is already a part of it, because there's some issues with that as it currently states as far as how accurate it is in searching people.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of like the background check system, I was reading a little bit about that. And, some people have said enhancing the background check and like standardizing it might be like a really good common sense thing. And as it stands, it's more of like a 3-day process. So like, the FBI instant background checks, like with it, 90% of them come back immediately with a positive result. Like you can get this. But there's something called the default proceed loophole that if a background check throws any red flags, the FBI has 3 days to resolve any question marks or the person can buy the gun anyway. And if it turns out that, the person was able to buy the gun because whoever didn't investigate during that 3 days, if they get access to one, even though they weren't supposed to, the ATF actually has to actively seek out and reclaim that weapon. But that's not really a practical solution. So I think the background process needs to be revamped as well. And what's interesting is that Dalen Roof, who was the shooter in the Charleston church shooting, he was technically ineligible, but he benefited from the default proceed law, and we see what happened.
Yep. The tragedy that happened. And I saw not too long ago, this politician, there was this video kind of going viral and he was saying like, it's easier to purchase a gun than it is. Or he was able to get a gun quicker than he was able to get a cup of coffee because he would go to he actually filmed himself going to the gun show. And during this, he was like, asking people, they had assault rifles that were selling him guns. And he was like, hey, cause he had a hidden camera. He was like, hey, I want to get this gun. And they were like, sure, hey, I'll pay for it, whatever. And then he was like, oh, I need a background check or, they were like, oh, you don't look crazy. You're fine. I'm sure you're good. You're not trying to kill. And they would just like literally give him the gun that easy. And so this is a big issue again, when they're talking about like gun show sales and private sales of guns. This is a big issue of, people like Dylan Roof can get through from the traditional background search, doing it the legal way, but then you can also go to a gun show. And if you just, don't look crazy, according to whoever's selling the gun, they will just give it to you and not follow all the protocols too, which is an issue. But we'll definitely talk more about that in detail a little bit later on. We talk about particular types of reform and what works and doesn't work.
I just want to note that what does don't look crazy actually look like?
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure that's racially contingent.
It was just because he was a white male politician that was there with a bunch of other white males selling guns. And so pretty much like, hey, you look like me. No red flags.
No red flags there.
No red flags here. Man, this is crazy. What's going on? And, one of the big issues with American guns is the fact that we have so many guns in circulation. There are estimates of about 300 million guns in this country, when there's about a little over 323 million people in this country. So there's almost a gun per person, which is pretty insane if you think about it. Yeah.
I agree. So you just mentioned how many guns we have in the United States. And I just want to talk a little bit more about the reasons. You mentioned earlier that the number one reason, or the top reason, is so-called safety and self-defense. And, there are other reasons that they don't seem to be cited as often as safety, but I just kind of want to talk about those a little bit more to see, are they actually valid? Especially when we talk about safety, do guns actually keep us safe? So, yeah.
Yeah.
Do they?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, the biggest reason, 67% of people saying they want guns for protection, right? And so the next question would be, if we're trying to look at data, right, how many people actually use their guns in self-defense, right? That would be really addressing the point. Is this reason for having guns a valid reason? Are people actually using guns in times of, danger or what have you? And so first I want to talk about, and I know for many of our listeners, those of you in academia, you understand this. And some of our listeners who are not in academia may not. When it comes to certain research findings, some people like to overgeneralize, and the media can run with it. And then it'll take some time afterwards for other scholars to test what this one person is saying to see if it was actually true or not. And so this was actually the case with one of the big studies that came out earlier on a few years ago, talking about how many Americans actually use guns for defensive measures, for self-defense. So we'll start with the guy who first initiated this, and his name is Gary Kleck. And from his research, he found that 2.5 million Americans use guns for defensive purposes, for self-defense. Okay. During this time, many news outlets were taking it and running with this number, 2.5 million Americans need guns for self-defense, which is a pretty high number. Okay. And other academics and professors was I don't know if I fully agree with that number because it's quite large. And so Harvard professor David Hemingway and others wanted to kind of redo the study to see how accurate it was. And they used a more accurate measure called the NCVS, which is the National Crime Victimization Survey, because what Gary Kleck did, the original person, he did his own individual survey where he interviewed and surveyed 5,000 people. Okay. Now, out of his 5,000 people, right, only 1.3% of that 5,000, which was 66 people, said that they use guns for self-defense. Now, you're probably wondering, how did he get from 66 people to 2.5 million? Well, what he did was simply take that 1.3% and multiply it by the United States population, right, which is a big no-no. He overgeneralized, right? Because the sample size was pretty small, but everybody took that number. His sample only came with 66 people said they use it, right? But he said 2.5 million Americans, which is insane. So David Hemingway, Harvard professor, and others, they were like, okay, let's look at the NCVS, where they interviewed 60,000 people, okay, spread all around all the regions of the U.S. So it's more representative of what the U.S. is. And they found a very small percentage of used guns for defensive measures. Their research said that about 100,000 cases on average in the U.S. are where guns are used for self-defense, which is about 0.0003% of the U.S. population. All right. So again, you can see how people are using numbers incorrectly, and we got the more accurate. So it's not 2.5 million. What it is actually about 100,000 people are using guns. Out of the 323 million Americans, about 100,000 people are using guns for self-defense.
Mm-hmm. So in thinking about that, the self-defense, especially in these recent mass shootings, people have said oh, if more people had guns, they'd be able to stop the bad guy. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I don't know. Is there like any like research or insight into that? Like, is that true?
Yeah, so this is a big statement of the NRA. Kind of like, if you have to have a gun to protect yourself or somebody else in a gun. Even when I have conversations on campus and debates, people who have guns, they'll be like, I don't want to be in a situation, where this guy has a gun and I don't, get caught off guard. Well, there's been some research that has followed that as well. And what they found was that 80% of those people that said they used a gun in self-defense said that they were the only person with a gun in the altercation, debunking that image of the good guy versus the bad guy with the gun, right? So again, 80% of people who are using guns for self-defense, they're the only ones with a gun in the situation.
So that kind of reminds me of like the scene from Friday where Craig's dad was like, you think you need a gun? Like, that's a punk. Like back in my day, when we were fighting, we used our hands. Like we didn't need to bring guns to fist fights. Like, how do you feel unsafe? You're the only one with the gun.
Only one with the gun. And even in, within these surveys, when they looked at it, they found that in 2/3 of the cases, right, using a gun to protect property itself, just protect property, did work. But it also found, kind of going back to what you were saying too, right? Guns are legal in some are illegal, but you can't get certain things, maybe like mace, pepper spray, whatever. And they said that it found that mace, baseball bats, or sometimes even just yelling was just as effective as using a gun. Like, you can scare off people by just yelling or having a bat or having mace, just as effective of having a gun as far as getting people away from your property. And when you think about criminal offending too, it kind of makes sense, right? When people are trying to like steal from you, it's not confrontational. They're trying to wait when you're not home, right? They're trying to think if they catch you off guard and they're there, they don't want no smoke. They don't want no problems. They're trying to get out of there ASAP, right? And so, yes, yelling could probably like, what are you doing here? Get out of my house. Or having a bat, they're just trying to get out of there because they're not trying to be confrontational. They're trying to steal things when they think you're not there. So it kind of makes sense. But that whole good guy with a gun versus bad guy with a gun, again, the data's showing it's not that true.
Is there any link between I guess what is the link? So we have talked about maybe it isn't this good guy thing. Maybe it's a guy that is just afraid to defend himself or that, they just can't win a fight. Yeah. Is there a link? So thinking about the bad guys with guns, what is the link between guns and actual crime?
That's a good one. Well, first, I want to start off by saying that the Center for Disease Control, right, when we're talking about, they follow everything and the death rates and stuff like that. And so when it comes to deaths by gun violence, right, 2/3 of American gun deaths are by suicides, right? So again, this is pretty much saying that people are using guns and who are dying from guns are turning it on themselves and not using it against other people. So more than 30,000 people die annually from guns. 110 of those are kids killed accidentally by guns. 81,000 people have gun injuries but are non-fatal. Okay. And, a lot of the things that we see in the news and the media with mass shootings, this is important because although mass shootings do make the news and are very traumatic in a lot of ways, they're actually a very small portion of overall gun homicides. Okay. Most of the gun homicides, and the reality too is that most of the gun homicides come from handguns and not assault rifles. This is a big part of the debate where everybody's like, ban assault rifles, ban assault rifles. That can happen and that makes sense. We may see less mass shootings, but I don't think we'll see a big dent going on as far as gun deaths and gun violence in our country if we just only address assault rifles. And just really quickly looking at us compared to the rest of the world, the U.S. has some of the highest rates of mass shooting, though, in the world. We're ranked number 4 behind Norway, Finland, and Switzerland. But this is misleading because those countries are very small. And so having one mass shooting there just creates this higher per capita rate. But as far as countries with our size, we are by far leading the world as far as mass shootings and gun violence.
So thinking about that, and also thinking about what you mentioned about the study that was just like completely quantitatively just not sound. We have to be very careful when we look at numbers or when the media, they're using numbers. So I think it is often like cited that like, oh, there have been like 290 like school shootings. And so we have to like really dig into that number. Cause like you were saying in terms of like the mass shootings, how they're not as like frequent or as like prevalent as we think about. Only 22 of those shootings have been the ones where we think about where there have been like multiple deaths. A lot of them are like, have been like suicide, or maybe it was like a very targeted kill. Like there, like last year, I think, a husband like went to the wife's job, which was at a school, and like killed her and killed himself. So it like the mass shootings are tragic, and one is more than what we need. But like when we see numbers like 290 school shootings, it's not accurate when we're thinking about like Parkland or Columbine or things of that nature. There have only been like, not only, there have been 22 since 1990. And that's one too many. Like that's just too many.
Oh, it's certainly a lot. And yeah, it's a good point, because even when I was following, sometimes when I share with my students, I think it's CNN that does this kind of running tally of following like school shootings, and they kind of give a quick blurb about what happened. And a lot of the school shootings that happen are just like shootings that happen on school property, right? So they're happening like after hours, nobody's there. And a lot of times they're like adults. Maybe somebody was like selling drugs or something like that on a high school parking lot, went wrong. Somebody shot somebody. And that gets classified in their database as a school shooting because it happened on school property, but it wasn't like kids were in school and doing that. So we do have to be a little more careful as far as how we consume this information and what is actually what we think of. When people hear school shootings, they're thinking of somebody going in there while kids are in classes and shooting up a bunch of kids, which has happened and it's terrible. But a vast majority of them, as far as what's being reported and calculated, are not that. So yeah, that's a good observation.
Agree. And I think one issue with being able to talk about gun violence and trends accurately is the fact that the CDC has their hands tied by legislation, so they don't have the funding to accurately study information about trends in gun violence. You know, a while ago, I think it was in the mid 1990s, they actually wanted to study gun violence and gun deaths as a public health crisis in the same way they might look at like cigarettes or other issues that are deadly and impact U.S. citizens. But going back to the NRA's lobbying power, they were able to produce or help to produce legislation that didn't necessarily make it like illegal for like the CDC to collect data. But what happened is there was like an amendment or like a certain part of the bill that effectively removed all funding to be able to do that research. So that we are missing a lot of information because they don't want the information out there.
That's very true. And especially with this administration, I know, he did things like that with EPA and stuff like that, trying to talk about climate change and saying, yo, you can't do research or you can't say certain things. Like, that's insane. Like, how are we supposed to move forward as a society if we're not understanding what's hurting our society or changing our society? But they just want to keep things because if this information leaks, then they can hurt their pockets, hurt their dollars, hurt their votes.
It's all about that mighty dollar, to be honest.
Yeah.
So, Ty, you actually mentioned, like gun deaths related to suicide. We talk about like guns and crime and like whether, things will actually be reduced or increased. And I was actually wondering if you could talk more about suicide and guns and whether suicide rates could actually be potentially impacted by gun reform.
Yeah. So the NRA, many supporters of the NRA, they believe that removing guns will not have an influence on suicide rates. Their philosophy is, hey, if people want to kill themselves, they're going to kill themselves no matter what. right? And we can't just blame guns as far as suicides, the suicide rates, even though the CDC says 2/3 of gun violence is a result of suicides. So what does the research say when they talk about suicide? And so researchers who have studied suicide for decades say that this is not true. They say that if you take out the main cause of suicide, okay, you will see a decrease in overall suicide rates. The NRA believes, they say like, you take away guns and people are still going to kill themselves by hanging themselves or doing other things. Well, most research show that that's not the case. It shows that when you change the most popular method of suicide, we see that, which is known as means restriction, okay, we see that the impact of suicide goes down. And a lot of these studies have been conducted in other countries. And of course, it can be seen. I remember one particular study they followed and they looked at people were using this particular bridge to jump off of to commit suicides, right? Mm-hmm. And what they did was that they were like, okay, we want to see a reduction in suicide rates. Let's make a change here. So they put up, guardrails and like netting and all that stuff so people couldn't jump off of it anymore. Right. And so what happened is they did see a slight uptick in suicides by hanging. Right. But overall, the suicide rates dramatically decreased because they took out that one form of how everyone was killing themselves. OK. And I've even seen in research and talking to other people who are in, the psychology field and stuff like that. With dealing with suicide, time is very important, right? So guns, instantaneous. But if somebody, a lot of suicide research shows that when you create a gap between when somebody thinks about the act and commits the act, when there's a gap in time, the decrease of the act being completed, the percentage of the act being completed decreases, right? Just having a little bit of time. And so even with all of this being said, if you take away guns and if people were to try to commit suicide, just the fact that it would take time to do that is already going to have a dramatic decrease. But all research has shown that when you take out the number one reason or number way of suicide, then suicide dramatically decreases. And in this country, it's guns that are used for suicides the most. And so if we try to figure out a way to limit that or restrict that, we will see a dramatic decline in suicide rates.
Yeah. So like in thinking about that, like taking away the means can have an impact on the outcome. Is that also the case in terms of people using guns on other people? Like, how some states might enact laws that might make guns more restrictive or things of that nature. Is it the same with using guns on someone other than yourself?
Yeah. So I think what you're asking is like, can guns like reduce crime maybe, overall?
Can guns reduce crime, but also can like gun laws. So you mentioned like the laws, like restricting access to guns could reduce like suicide rates or reduce, because that is taking away one means of committing suicide. Is it the same with like homicide or gun assault?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So do guns, can it influence crime? First, well, again, similar to what we talked about before when we talked about, the percentage of people using guns for self-defense measures. This guy by the name of John Lott in the 90s, another similar situation where he said that guns can reduce crime, right, overall in the 90s. And ever since, of course, other researchers have tried to redo his research and found that it's been not correct. It's been largely discredited. The number of guns in a state can influence overall crime rates. Well, the question is, do the number of guns in a state, can they influence overall crime rates? And what we've seen is that no, because in this country, right, states that have lots of guns, such as Montana, have very low crime rates. But there are states also with lots of guns, like Alaska, and they also have very high crime rates. So the U.S. has a lot of guns, but overall the crime rate is pretty much the same as it is in other developed countries. And, part of the debate is, we've seen in the 90s, right, because when Lott did his research is that, crime rates across the world were decreasing. And so because he saw this uptick in gun ownership, he thought it was related to the crime decrease was related to gun ownership, which was not the case. It was just that nobody can explain why the crime decreased, and it decreased everywhere in the entire globe. And people say maybe it has to do with population, maybe it has to do with different things, but it definitely wasn't about the guns ownership. But can guns influence crime overall? Not really. But can it influence particular crimes? Like you said, homicides? Yes. Okay. Pretty much when the guns are used in the middle of an altercation, about 16,000 people are killed and 11,000 people are killed with guns in this country. States with more guns do have higher rates of homicide. Okay. And I think what's important to know as well is that this rate of gun ownership and homicide rates does have a particular impact on a particular set of the population. And that demographic is with females. Guns that have, states that have more guns has a higher rate of female homicide, which is important. So it does have an effect on women. So where people are like, oh, let's add more guns or let's have less restrictions on guns, we probably will see an uptick on female homicides. And a lot of that has to do with domestic violence, intimate partner relationship, and, pretty much most of the cases of the men using the gun on the women because they have more access to it.
So with that, I'd actually like to note and point out that according to the Violence Policy Center, Black women experience the highest rates of gun homicide of any group of women. And to even go beyond that, the rate of gun homicide deaths for Black women exceeds that of white men.
Crazy.
So when we think about this, we have to think about things overall, but it's also important that we kind of take a microscope to these data and see how it is not just impacting the country overall, but also how it is impacting Black people and Black families and Black children and all those things.
Yeah. That's a good segue into talking about race a little bit, and gender and how gun deaths are related in this country. There's a study in 2017 in the Journal of Pediatrics, and they used data from the CDC, Center of Disease Control and Prevention. And they found that African-American children had the highest rates of firearm mortality overall. They actually are 10 times more likely to be killed by guns compared to their white counterparts, which is insane, right?
Yes. And you just have to think about, in thinking about potentially, you mentioned the intimate partner violence and how that contributes to the death of women by gun violence. And you talk about just the exposure that Black children are having. And just think about how might that impact them psychologically,
Yeah, there's truth to that. I feel like if anything, right, the trauma, associated with that. And some studies have found in 2015 study by Brookings Institution found that kids or people who experience these things have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and are depressed, also have poor academic performance, can be linked to substance abuse and risky sexual behavior, delinquency, violent behavior, all of this because of exposure to gun violence. So it is not just this is happening, and even just being in that environment or knowing people are seeing it or witnessing it, will have profound impacts on just the livelihood of these people.
And then when you see how that stress and trauma related to gun violence might interact with the stress and trauma of just being Black and, other identities in America and the discrimination, wow, we are traumatized people in a lot of ways.
Yeah, when you think about that, that's true, right? Just racism and discrimination without the gun violence is already just traumatic in itself. And then you add being exposed to such horrific violence. Oh my goodness. It's really got me thinking about it.
Yeah. So it's kind of what I want to know is thinking about the impact, thinking about its relationship to not crime overall, but homicides, its relationship to potentially suicides and, being able to lower these things is how do we make a change? How do how do we enact common sense reform? What is common sense reform? Like, what can actually work? Because I think we talk about a lot of things. I think people talk about things that like feel like they might work, but what are the things that might actually work, and how do we get those things enacted?
Yeah, that's a big question. Figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So currently, right, the way it works, and for those of you who may not have ever tried to purchase a gun in this country, or some of you may have, it's called Form 4473, which is, the form that is used when you want to buy a gun. And generally what this form does, and when you try to get a gun, it gets you in touch with police to run a background check. The response from the background check will either be an approval, a denial, or research, meaning the department needs more time, kind of what Daphne was talking about earlier. And the two major reasons that you will get denied in this country from owning a gun, one is having or being convicted of a crime and sentenced to longer than 1 year in prison. And then the second one is if you were found to be mentally ill. And the way they look at if someone is mentally ill is if you've been admitted into an institution, right? That's the main way that they're looking at in the background check. So someone could be mentally ill and have never been admitted into a institution and can still potentially get a gun, right? So that's key.
Because a lot of people don't even seek out mental health services.
And it varies, even when talking about the conviction of a crime, it varies in states. So I know in Indiana, I had a friend that got a gun, and I think the law was like you had to just have less than 3 misdemeanors. He filled out the form, sent it in the mail. A month later, got his approval back in the mail and was able to purchase a gun that easily, right? So states can be some flexible as far as what kind of crimes can be. And in most cases, as long as if you were in jail or prison for less than a year, you still may qualify for gun ownership.
That's interesting. Yeah. I guess in thinking about that, seeing how easy it was for your friend to get a gun, what is there any research on whether better background checks will actually improve things? Because I feel like when we think about like, oh, if Dylan Roof didn't have that gun, or like the first thing that people talk about is mental health. Anytime these mass shootings happen, the first thing they want to say, oh, there's probably mental illness, or there's probably, this. So that seems like a common sense solution, but would it actually work? And we also, like we mentioned earlier, that is something that gun owners and non-gun owners alike overwhelmingly, like 89%, agree with.
So that's the big thing, right? And I hope our listeners will get this from this conversation, is that the debate isn't like this black or white issue, right? It's not like, oh, yay, get rid of all guns, yay, get more restrictions, or no, it's not going to work. It's not more details and nuance to that. And so one of the biggest things is with both sides, like you said, Daphne, agree on is having better background checks. And, the NRA believes that there are holes in the FBI database and reporting system. And they say that, hey, the FBI is not doing a good job at tracking this. Again, you kind of talked about that earlier. And they're missing people who should be caught in the system. And states report this information to the FBI voluntarily. So states with the worst background check system did have the highest number of gun homicides. So we do see some relationship there. But the thing is like the idea is that if we have better background checks, we will see less guns being used less in crimes. Well, studies have shown that most prisoners incarcerated for gun violence didn't get their guns from licensed dealers, right? And a study of 1,400 inmates who committed gun crimes, only 77% of them said they got their guns on the street, and 11% of them said they got it from a licensed dealer. And also, many of the would-be criminals would actually pass a background check when buying a gun because they haven't committed the crime yet, right? So if somebody wants to get a gun to commit a crime, if they've never committed a crime, they're not going to be red flagged in the system, and they can still use that gun for crimes. But almost 80% of those who are using guns or who have been convicted for gun violence have gotten the guns illegally off the street or from private vendors. So that means if we did create stricter background measures, it still wouldn't capture this group of folk who are using guns for, the bad purposes. So better record keeping can help, but we really don't know by how much, because some estimates say about 50% of criminals would pass a background check regardless.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of reminds me of like the mental illness piece. Mm-hmm. Like we mentioned earlier, how do you look at someone? You can't look at someone and say, oh, they are mentally ill. I would say 99% of the cases. I mean, some people, I don't know.
Well, yeah, some people you can.
Yeah. But for the most part, like that would be really hard to say. Like, and we could also be potentially. Have you ever seen the movie Minority Report, where like they're trying to predict future crime? Yeah. Like how? Like I feel like that when the mental health would be really difficult to implement, like unless everybody has to like go to a psychiatrist and get a mental health evaluation before getting a gun.
Yeah.
I don't know how that one would work.
That would be tough. And that's another big thing. And I have conversations with my students about this. One, I'm just very hesitant to say, let's target the mentally ill. One, because they're already a stigmatized group in a lot of ways. And so now we're targeting this population for the cause of all our gun violence, which, is already a thing I don't feel super comfortable with. I think it's something that we should question and figure out ways to navigate as we figure out how we want to do things with gun reform. And there's a couple things when we talk about, does it actually work or can it work if you keep guns away from the mentally ill? Now, one study looked at 88 mass shooters and found that the overall prevalence of mental illness was very low. So a lot of the people who were doing mass shootings really may not have had that in like extreme, psychiatric issues and stuff like that. Even the case with the Parkland school shooting, the kid who he shot up everybody. He had recently gone through things with his parents dying and stuff like that, was depressed, but anything institutionally with the fact that he would be institutionalized, probably not, which we have to keep an name. And some of these cases too with mass shootings have been linked to, psychiatric drugs as well, that have kind of altered their mind and desensitized people, not really being clear of their actions. So also a part of the conversation is people who are being treated for mental illness are getting medication that is actually causing them to be violent or be desensitized to violent in the acts they commit is a part of it too. And so, and the American Journal of Public Health tracked gun homicides from 2001 to 2010. And, they only found that 5% of the 120,000 homicides were committed with people who were actually diagnosed with a mental illness. And 95% of all violent crimes that were carried out by people, they had no mental illness. And many psychiatrists also say that there's really no, like you said, like Minority Report, there's really no report. There's no really clinical or real way to determine future criminality. Yes, you can diagnose somebody, but you can't say, hey, don't get this person a gun because they're going to shoot people. They said, most people say you just might as well flip a coin if that's the case.
And that's really scary to think about because we all know who they would target.
Oh, yeah.
Sips tea. Yeah. We already know. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the gun crimes are committed by people who didn't even get guns legally. So I know one popular reform or program that targets especially those who, might get amnesty for turning in guns that they got illegal. It's like the gun buyback programs or like, drop off, you can drop off the guns, no question asked type thing. And like, do those work?
Yeah, I see those all the time, like these little trucks when I'm in Newark of police trucks and they, have little signs saying, hey, buy back your guns, no questions asked, all that kind of stuff. And it's this idea that police officers usually buy guns back from people, no questions asked. No, where you got it from, whose it is, etc. The idea is, hey, if we get guns off of the street, then we will see less gun violence. And overall, there was a study that tracked it this program for 5 years in Buffalo, New York, and apps found no effectiveness, no result in crime decrease, and it was just largely not effective. Mainly because people give back guns. Again, as we said earlier, people usually have more than one gun. And a lot of times people get rid of a gun they're not using or it's old and they make some change, but they're still retaining other guns and still owning other guns as well. So it really didn't have any effect on overall gun violence, and they're not effective. And other studies have shown this too, have looked at gun buyback programs at different states like Boston, et cetera, and they've largely been ineffective no matter the region.
So that was all just like kind of really depressing, because all the comments and things that people mention, you know, getting guns off the street, background checks, you know, mental illness, like it looks like a lot of research says this stuff doesn't work. So like, what can we do? Because that's like, okay, should we just throw our hands up? Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's another, good question. Does anything work when we talk about gun control at all? And I think one of the more promising things, and this is people look at what happened in Australia, gun reform. In 1996, Australia had a mass shooting. Okay. And after that mass shooting, their government was like, no way, we don't want this to happen again. The shooter had an assault rifle, and they were like, we're making change immediately, and for some reason, like
Australia said, nah.
They said, nah, we ain't doing this no more. For some reason, like you said, in America, we're 22, some odd mass shootings in, and we still haven't reached that point where we're like, nah, But what happened in Australia is after this mass shooting in 1996, which is known as the Port Arthur massacre, one of the things they did and what they get known for is that they banned semi-automatic and automatic weapons. Pretty much the government bought them back over a certain point of time. And after a deadline, if people were found to have these guns, they would have jail time and, be a criminal and break the law. And they would buy these guns back and they put them on. They pretty much crushed up all the guns. Now, before this ban, there were 13 mass shootings with 5 or more people in Australia. After the gun buyback program and after they banned assault rifles, there were none. No more mass shootings. And the risk of dying by gun violence reduced by half, which includes their homicide and suicides and unintentional gun deaths solely by this alone. All right.
Wow. Wow.
So, it is quite effective that we've seen in Australia.
So it's interesting that you say that, because we just talked about how like the buybacks in the U.S. didn't work. So it's like, did they do anything else besides the buyback? Because it kind of contradicts what we just said about like buybacks not working.
Yeah, that's a big point. So, we see that the Australia gun death rate is 10 times lower and has been on decline ever since they did this than the US is. But, even though most people look at the Australia gun reform and look at that they did ban automatic and assault rifles, that's not all they did, because before they had the ban, there were 3 million guns in circulation, right, in Australia. And there were about 640,000 semi-automatic and automatic weapons. And today, well, there's still about 3 million guns in circulation in Australia. So the amount of guns is still the same. And gun culture is still very prevalent. They still use guns for hunting and sporting and all the reasons they did before. And this is part of the conversation here in America. Like, we take away these guns and people still can't enjoy them from sport and hunting. No, you still can. In Australia, they still do. They still have a very, very popular gun culture there. And since 2014, there's only been 31 gun homicides, right? But so the question is, well, what else did they do? And this is what I think us as Americans need to start talking about with reform. And pretty much what they did was treat gun ownership the same way they treat car ownership. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. We do, for a car in this country, you gotta, go to the DMV and the government has to be registered and you have to re-register and it has to pass all these checks and you have to do all these steps to just own a car. Even when you want to sell a car, you have to get a title. It has to all be formal processes. Whereas a gun, we don't have the same, kind of rigor attached to that. So it's quite interesting. I'll talk a little bit, but it also makes me think too, like when we talk about, this whole thing, gun reform and all that kind of stuff and gun violence, it's like, why do we care? Like the conversation is, Second Amendment, they're taking our rights away. Well, I think part of the conversation, even when Obama was in office, it's like, we're not trying to take away your right to own a gun, right? We're just trying to change the way you own a gun. And I feel like everybody should be on board as far as let's take gun ownership more seriously, right? It's like we do cars. We should be able to do the same exact thing for guns.
Yep. And they'll take away, you do something irresponsible with a car, they will take away your license or suspend your license and things of that nature. And so I kind of agree, but I don't know, people might feel like maybe I won't be eligible if I actually had to think about being responsible with why I want to own the gun, what I plan to do with it. And if I have to regularly check in like once a year just to, say what's going on and renew things. But I do think that makes sense.
Yeah. So what they did in Australia is, one, you had to have a genuine, real reason as far as why you wanted to own a gun. So it had to be for like sporting, hunting, collecting, but you were not allowed to get a gun if you just said it's for self-defense, which is what we allow in this country. It had to be for another reason. Then you had to get a license for the gun. Right. Follow the process. You had to register your gun with the government, similar to what you do with cars. If you wanted to sell the gun, now this is important. I think this is one of the biggest issues we have in this country. If you wanted to sell the gun, and you had to sell it by a licensed dealer, right, or in front of a police officer. Those are the only two authorized places you can sell a gun. Now, this is an issue which we didn't talk about earlier. We talked about the ATF and stuff. When a gun, so what happens is a lot of the times, say for instance, we'll use Chicago, because there's a lot of gun violence happening in Chicago, right? And it's important to know that Illinois has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, similar to like New York. The strictest gun laws so people are like, oh, why is all this gun violence happening in Chicago? Let's make more restrictions. They have some of the strictest laws you can have as far as gun ownership, but yet Chicago is ridden by a lot of gun violence, etc. One of the reasons because of this is because its neighboring states, like Indiana, have some of the most relaxed gun laws in the country. So what happens is people buy guns or get guns easily in a state like Indiana, and they cross state borders and then sell it to people in Chicago, etc. Right? And so what happens is the guns that are found in Chicago, say there's a homicide, they find the gun is registered to somebody in Indiana. They will go back to Indiana and say, hey, this gun was registered to you. What happened? All they have to do is say the gun was stolen, and they are now legally not responsible for whatever actions happen to with that gun, right? They have to walk away. ATF, there's nothing they can do. That's all they have to say. Hey, it was stolen from me. No questions asked. So in Australia, if the gun is stolen, okay, it has to be reported to the police. If it is not reported to the police and something happens with that gun, you also will be held criminally responsible for whatever actions happen to that. That's key, because in our country, we allow the guns to be, traded privately amongst a bunch of people, and nobody is held criminally or legally responsible when actions happen. And so I think that's a big thing that they did that was right. And every time a gun changes hands, the government has to know about it, right? So I think this will happen. It's called a thing like straw purchasing and stuff like that, where people are getting guns from different places, from people who buy guns legally and then sell it to others at a much higher price.
Yeah, I feel like that is not a good idea or it is an easy way to let people get away with crime. Like, oh, it was stolen. I don't know nothing about that.
It's crazy.
No. And that's not responsible at all. Like, if your gun is stolen, like me personally, even if there was no law, if I owned a gun and it was stolen and I know it was registered to me, honey, I don't want my name turning up in nobody's crime. So, I would want to tell anyway. Any responsible gun owner should want something like that.
Yeah, very true.
It just seems like maybe Australia just has a very different culture to be able to actually enact some of these things. I would not see a lot of these things going over well because, like you said, it's always they're trying to take away our guns, even when it's just a conversation about we just want to make gun ownership a little bit more responsible. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's part of the conversation. To me, if I were to part of this debate, I'd be like, all right, we're not even going to touch the Second Amendment. Like, I don't want to talk about that. Whatever. You still have your right to own guns. What I'm talking about is that we need to make gun owners responsible, just as responsible or even more responsible than you would somebody that has a vehicle. And I feel like it should be no questions about that, right? It's a gun. It's a weapon. You should be able to go through the same kind of processes with that. Interesting thing too. So the UK had a similar reform like Australia. They also had a mass shooting in 1996. Government was like, nah, we ain't doing this no more. And they banned handguns. What's interesting though, and this is funny, kind of funny, right? Even though they banned handguns, handgun crime doubled, okay, during this time period after they banned handguns. What happened is there was an increase in gang activity, okay? And so a lot of the gangs didn't hand in their handguns, which is partially true. But what the UK stats, again, when we talk about statistics and how you consume these things, what they did in their gun crime stats is they also included, when they talked about gun-related crimes and incidences, they also included fake guns. So a lot of handguns were banned. A lot of guns that were being sold in the black market and the guns that were used by gang members were fake handguns that were just painted black, right? And so but they also were still being calculated as handgun statistics. So overall, there was like a lower rate of gun violence, but gun crimes were doubled because there was a more uptick as far as fake guns being used during this time period. One study, a gang task force, arrested 70 to 80 gang members at one time and recovered 1,000 guns. Okay. Out of the 1,000 guns, only 10 of them were real. Okay. So that means 990 guns were fake. So, you have to be careful that, the headline is, handguns banned, handgun crime doubled, but it's because they were using fake guns and not real guns. So again, it was still effective there, banning guns as well, which is funny.
Yeah. I don't know. This is just an interesting conversation. And I hope that we can start having a conversation that isn't like gaslighting or isn't like skewing what people are saying about like gun reform and legislation. This issue is just far too important. And I feel, especially in this time now when we are like extra hella polarized and people are doing crazy things and like talking about crazy things about, because one thing I found interesting is that there are these things called preppers who are prepping for potentially like a civil war. Like, we need to like really make sure we know who is owning guns because there are people that are just out there. And then, so yeah.
Yeah. And, just to close, right? Black folks, we have to pay attention to this because although gun violence is a thing that happens everywhere, it's something that is more prominent and can be more detrimental with gun violence to the Black community. Looking at stats between 2011 and 2013 with U.S. gun deaths by race and gender, right? Per 100,000, Black men were the highest with about 34, where white men was just like about 16, right? Per 100,000. And even going and looking at a particular age between the ages of 20 and 29 years old, right? Black men is 90 per 100,000, whereas white men is about 20 per 100,000. And even when we talked about suicide, right? U.S. gun deaths by type and race, majority of gun deaths that happen to white folk, almost about 80% between 2011 and 2013 were from suicide. Okay. From suicide. And then majority of it for Blacks was homicides. So we have to pay particular attention to the differences as far as the discussion of what we want to address, because a lot of the conversation is being focused on suicides, which is important when we relate to gun violence. But if we create policy that only addresses that, and not homicides, then it's going to be skewed as far as who's affected. It's going to be skewed as far as helping out more white folks than black folks, where homicide, addressing gun violence and homicide in particular, helps black men and women more than it would other groups. So we need to pay attention as far as what we want to see reformed and what we want to see change. There has to be really, of informed intent behind what we choose to do.
I agree. It reminds me of our discussion of like the opioid crisis, as well as the legalization of weed, in a sense that when we think about issues that are like potentially a public health issue or might impact, different communities, that we have to do it in ways that don't just positively impact, communities that are already advantaged or already benefit from laws in ways that don't benefit minority groups. So that is a good point. I always appreciate your perspective, Ty.
I always appreciate your perspective and insight questions. And, it's good. It's always good to have these conversations. We know the Gambino video sparked this debate amongst other things. And, I just want to take some time to really talk to you all, our listeners, about gun control and what it all means, so you can leave here, be a little bit more informed and bring more to the conversation, and realize it's just not like, binary issue, black or white, that it's easy to do, yay to guns and no to guns. It's, to me, what is going to result as being effective. What are we going to change? It's actually going to see a decrease in mass shootings. What do we need to do to see a decrease in gun violence and homicide rates? And what we need to do is see a decrease in suicide rates. And whatever gets us there is what we should be talking about, is what's most important. And changing the Second Amendment right, or fighting about that, is not going to change the lives that are being lost as a result to guns. Right.
Well, I hope our listeners will give us some more topics to talk about, because I actually really enjoy being able to become like way knowledgeable on these subjects by having these conversations with you. So I hope they'll send us some topics to talk about.
Send us topics. Hey, the summertime is here for us, so we got time to research some things and talk about some things. And, many of you probably are not in academia, so you may not get the summers off. So there might be things you want to learn about, and hear about it during your commute, or while you're in the gym, or while you're going for walks, or whatever it is you're doing, or cooking. I know some people listen to us while they cook, and some while they're in the gym, some while they're driving. Whatever it is, whatever you're doing, just give us some topics. And like Daphne said, we'll chat with you about it.
Right?
Alrighty. Good conversation. Until next time, again, follow us on social media at BHD Podcast. Email us, bhdpodcast@gmail.com. Review, rate. We've been getting more reviews and rates on iTunes, so keep that up, please. If you have not and you are listening to us, please review and rate us. We really appreciate that a lot. And, as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.